I didn't turn my recording back on, so I just did. So we'll have most of today's lecture on there. So kids who were abused as kids are more likely to be arrested for violent crimes as juveniles or adults. So abuse may lead into criminal behavior in the future. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychological disorder that people can get as the result of trauma. Now, not everyone who has a trauma will experience PTSD, but certainly if you have been the victim of a trauma, whether it is a motorized vehicle accident, combat trauma, sexual assault, natural disaster, terrorist attack, what have you, you can face the consequences of these symptoms. They experience intense fear-related reactions when reminded of the trauma. And the symptoms of PTSD include the following. And I know some of you have learned this in abnormal psychology, but I know others of you may not have taken it. And there's sort of, PTSD is kind of thrown around a lot, right, in our vernacular. And so I think it's really important to understand what PTSD actually is. You need to have a history of having experienced, witnessed, or confronted events that involve actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. So you can have it happen to you, or you could witness it happening. One of the things I liked that they updated when they made the new edition of the DSM in 2013 is that if for your job you are required to watch violent things on media, you can actually be diagnosed for PTSD from that. So for example, I had a vet I saw while I was at the VA who his job had been to sit in a tent in Iraq and watch the footage from helmet cams all day. And so he would see, marketplace bombings and things, IED explosions all day, every day. And at that time, they hadn't made this change. So it was sort of like, can I diagnose him with PTSD for this? And we decided yes, but now that's much more clear. You also need to have one or more of the following intrusive symptoms. So recurrent, involuntary, and distressing memories, recurrent, distressing dreams, some nightmares, basically. Dissociative reactions such as flashbacks. So if you're not familiar with what a flashback is, it is in the moment, something reminds you of the trauma and you actually feel like you're back in the moment of the trauma. So for example, Vietnam vets, when they hear a car backfire, they'll hit the deck. Modern vets, OIF vets, Iraq and Afghanistan vets, they will sometimes all of a sudden start driving in the middle of the road instead of their lane because something will remind them of an IED explosion. If you are the survivor of sexual assault, you might be having consensual sex with your partner, but then something reminds you of your assault and all of a sudden you're back in that moment, right? You have distress at exposure to things that remind you of the event, and those might be really obvious, or they might be, something that other people wouldn't see the clear connection. So for example, some of my Iraq and Afghanistan vets talked about the smell of sand bringing them back there. And before they said that, I didn't sort of recognize that sand had a distinct scent, but to them it did. Or again, seeing the person who might have attacked you or driving by the place where you had your car accident, for example. And then they also have marked physiological reactions to reminders of the event. So their breathing will speed up, their heart rate will speed up, they might break out into sweats, they might start shaking, things along those lines. Then they're going to avoid stimuli associated with the events, things that remind them of the event. And they'll might have a subjective sense of numbing or detachment or emotional unresponsiveness related to these. And this can be really distressing, disturbing, interfere with your life, for example. So, clients that I had who were survivors of military sexual trauma, they were sexually assaulted by a fellow service member, left the service. So left a really good paying job, right? Because of this, because they couldn't be around reminders. I had an Iraq vet who was working civil service for the DoD and left the room every time someone mentioned the war. You're working for the DoD, that's going to happen a lot, right? So it was really disruptive to his work. If you're avoiding driving and you have to drive for work, right? That's going to be really disruptive. Negative changes to cognitions, thoughts, and moods, like the inability to remember important aspects of the event. And there are actually neuropsychological, like brain-based reasons why that happens. Exaggerated negative beliefs about yourself, again, things like blaming yourself, thinking you're a horrible person because this happened to you, and persistent negative emotions. They have marked changes in arousal and reactivity. Hypervigilance is always being on your guard. So if any of you are close to someone who might be a law enforcement officer or, current or former military, sometimes when you go like into a restaurant, we can go into restaurants again, you'll find that they always sit with like their back to a wall so no one can sneak up on them and they can kind of see everything around them. That's hypervigilance. And then you also have an extreme or exaggerated startle reflex or startle response. So like if someone does sneak up on you, you're gonna jump a mile. One of my friends saw a client that they had to teach their young child not to wake him up because sometimes he would be having a nightmare and he would be thinking, he was back and this was an enemy combatant. And so he actually grabbed his kid by the throat once. The kid was fine, except for like emotionally really messed up about this, right? So that like when dad's sleeping, you can't wake him up, right? And then again, persistent negative emotions, just feeling essentially symptoms of depression. Sorry, I went back. Sleep disturbances is what I meant to talk about there. Yeah, so they'll have a hard time sleeping. They'll wake several times throughout the night, or maybe just have a hard time falling asleep. And they'll engage in other behaviors that sort of relate to these things. So a common injury of OEF, OIF vets is back and knee injuries because they carried so much gear and it really was a foot battle. Like they were walking around to different villages and cities a lot and knocking on doors. I had a guy whose knees were destroyed from that, and he had a several acre property, but because of his hypervigilance, he would walk the perimeter of his entire property nightly as sort of like making sure everything was okay. You have significant distress or impairment, and it has to last at least a month. There is a diagnosis you can be given prior to a month that's called acute stress disorder. And sometimes people just have that for a month, and sometimes that transitions into PTSD. You don't have to be diagnosed with PTSD right after the trauma. And in fact, when I was at the VA in 2009, 2010, we were still diagnosing folks who had fought in Vietnam. So that was the 70s at that point. Whenever the symptoms onset, whenever you seek care, we can provide care for it. Some statistics about PTSD. The lifetime prevalence of just experiencing a traumatic event, about 50% for women, 60% for men. And then about 7 to 9% of the general population meets criteria for PTSD. And Resnick, who is a big name in PTSD research, she actually developed one of the most effective treatments for PTSD, Patty Resnick. She found that 12% of a sample of women had symptoms of PTSD at some point in their lives, and 4.6% were currently suffering from PTSD. A lot of disorders are in the 1 to 2% range, so this is actually fairly common, unfortunately. As you can see, women, even though they might experience fewer traumatic events, are more likely to develop PTSD. So about 20% of women and 8% of men develop it afterwards. There's a whole host of reasons why this might be and why this might not be accurate. One is that men are more reluctant to seek care, or they might self-medicate with alcohol or other substances. Also, women are more likely to be victimized in terms of sexual assault, sexual violation, sexual abuse, and we know that that has higher rates of PTSD developing as a result. So some events like combat, disasters, abuse, and victimization are more likely to cause disorders than others. So these are like the probabilities, essentially, the amount of people who develop PTSD. So in general, 8 to 10%. Those OEF, OIF vets that I've been referencing, somewhere between 14 and 20% of them developed PTSD. If you've been wounded in combat, it gets you to that higher end. If you've been raped or sexual assault, half of those people at least develop full PTSD. Most experience at least some symptoms of PTSD. And I always think that this is sort of an interesting comparison, that that's the same level as people who have been prisoners of war, right? So the violation in sexual assault is such that it's equivalent to being a prisoner of war. People who had repeated high levels of combat exposure in Vietnam are at the 60% range. And then women who have trauma related to a crime, about 26% of them will develop PTSD. And it's more likely, just like with vets, if they are injured. And only 9% who have experienced non-criminal traumas, like say a motor vehicle accident, develop PTSD. So if you believe that your life is in danger, and if you believe you don't have control over what's happening, there's nothing you can do to stop it, you're more likely to develop PTSD at that point in time. Alrighty, so great job today, everybody. I really enjoyed your responses to the questions, and I will hang around for a minute in case anyone has any questions, comments they want to make to me. And if not, have a great weekend, and I will see some of you before then, but most of you next Tuesday.